Hello everyone, welcome to Interpersonal Communication. My name is Dr. Marlowe and I'm very happy to have this opportunity to work with you all this semester. I'm excited to get to know all of you, and I think that we will have a very interesting and hopefully a fun time this semester learning about relationships, learning about ourselves, and learning about other people and the way in which many of us interact in life. So before we begin, I just wanted to put a few announcements out there. Please make sure that you do acquire the textbook if you have not done so already. The textbook is called Looking Out, Looking In. It is written by Ronald Adler and Russell Proctor. I am working with the 14th edition myself. However, if you need to get an edition that is earlier, that is okay as well. I also wanted to announce that it's important that you check out the Blackboard Learn website that we will be using for this course. When you go onto the website, you should be able to access the syllabus. You should also be able to look at the assignments that are required. There is a module for every week that students will need to complete. Within each module, you will find a journal assignment, a discussion assignment. There will be a list of readings. Usually it's based on the chapter that you're reading that week. And then I will also be uploading the audio lecture every week for you folks to listen to. So please do make sure that you check out the website so that if you have any questions early on about course content or course material, you can let me know. And as always, please feel free to email me with any questions or concerns you might have about the course material or the course content. For this semester, I am only accessible through email, so please make sure that you do not try to reach me through my office telephone because I am not there to receive those messages this semester. Thank you very much, and let's get started with Chapter 1. To begin with, there are several motivations for why people communicate. On a very fundamental level, we communicate for our physical needs for human connection. So there is ample research that has found that human beings who are not socialized or do not appreciate or enjoy human relationships tend to suffer in terms of physical health. People who have positive, supportive relationships that are in place tend to have much better physical outcomes in terms of long-term health than people who don't. So the need for effective and supportive interpersonal relationships is a very established finding in terms of the research, and we can see that it does influence our overall well-being in terms of physical needs, in addition, identity needs, social needs, and practical goals. So we're going to go into each of these a little bit more in detail right now. In terms of identity, many of you probably are already aware of the fact that your identity is who you see yourself to be, right? So you have ideas about who you are, you have ideas about things that you are good at, maybe things that you're not good at. You have ideas about yourself in terms of whether you're smart or attractive, about whether you're kind or loving. And many of these ideas or identity needs or identity outcomes, if you will, that we experience happen through relationships. They happen through communication. So most of us learned about identity through our interactions with parents or family members growing up. In addition, as adults later in life, we communicate about identity and we establish our identity based on communication and the relationships that we have. So identity is another major reason for why we develop relationships in life. In addition, we also have social needs. Now, many of you who have 2 or 3 or maybe 5 or 6 good friends know the importance of having these relationships. Sometimes in life, things get difficult, and it is the relationships that we have, the positive social networks that we have in place that tend to sustain us and support us when we go through these challenging situations. So the human need for social connection is very established, and the need to have positive, supportive social relationships is a major communication motivation for people as well. And of course, you can think about your own experience in life and the importance of the relationships that you have and how those relationships meet your own social needs. So social needs is definitely one other communication motivation. But in addition, we also have practical needs. Practical needs deal more with just the day-to-day issues or day-to-day behaviors that we have to get done. So for example, if you're going over to, let's say, get your hair trimmed, you can tell the hairstylist how you want your hair cut. Let's say you're going to the grocery store and you need to buy a book of stamps for some reason. You can tell the person at the store that you need to buy some stamps. These are very practical needs for communication. But we can also look at practical needs in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And Abraham Maslow was a psychologist that believed that physical identity, social, and practical needs are basically organized into 5 categories, okay? And each of these categories, according to Maslow, need to be fulfilled in order for us to actually meet our ability to accomplish or identify or actualize ourselves. So, for example, Maslow believed that the most basic needs, physical needs, must be met before we can begin to think about things like social needs or self-esteem needs, okay? And in addition, Maslow also suggested that once we have our physical needs for air and water and food met, then we can concern ourselves with safety needs, feeling safe and protected. And beyond that, we have social needs and self-esteem. And only once all of those needs are met are we actually able to start to think about the need for what Maslow called self-actualization. Self-actualization deals with the human need to establish oneself in life, to have a personally meaningful life, to be able to become the best that we can be in life. These are all very practical needs. And these are some of the motivations that cause us to communicate and also to create relationships with people. There are several communication principles that we want to become familiar with throughout the course of this class. The first of these is that communication can be intentional, but communication can also be unintentional. So for example, many of you, when you are going through your first week or 2 of classes here at the university, you are intentionally communicating with your instructors about course expectations, about what kinds of needs you may have yourself that you need to have accommodations about in terms of assignments or descriptions for assignments, things like that. So a lot of the time we intend to send a certain message to people, but in addition, sometimes communication can be unintentional. So for example, we may be having a conversation that we think is private, and it's possible that somebody may overhear us. This is unintentional, right? And sometimes we might even be discussing topics that we especially didn't want someone to overhear, and we may have a challenging situation to deal with there. But it's also important to think about the ways in which nonverbal communication can sometimes send a message that is unintentional. So for example, if you are giving a public speech and you are intending to convince your audience, to persuade your audience to adopt a certain type of life practice, let's say recycling or something like that, and you tell your audience verbally that you are very confident that recycling is the wave of the future and that our world needs to begin to integrate this approach in order to save the environment, that would be the verbal component of your message. However, if you are saying verbally that you are very confident in this approach, but your nonverbals do not convey confidence, so for example, let's say you are not standing up straight, maybe you look nervous, maybe you are hedging or using like hedge words like that, things like that, you may actually be communicating to people that you are not confident in the topic that you are communicating about. So this is a good example for how communication can both be intentional and unintentional. And there is always the verbal component and the nonverbal component. And these are things that we definitely want to be aware of early on in this course. In addition, it's important to be aware of the fact that it is impossible not to communicate. So even if you do not say a word to somebody else, you are still sending a message, right? So you can think about the example, for instance, that many people have experienced at some point in life where they have a relationship with someone and maybe there's a conflict that takes place, and perhaps you've been on the receiving end of the silent treatment. The silent treatment where people do not communicate verbally, right? They might slam doors or, walk past you or things like that, and they are technically not communicating, but they are still communicating, right? So the second principle is that it is impossible not to communicate, and both intentional and unintentional communication does send a message. Another communication principle that's important to be aware of is that communication is irreversible and unrepeatable. What this means is that we are unable to go and undo something that we have said and done once the behavior has been enacted. So meaning oftentimes will be assigned by a receiver, okay? And a lot of times we tend to assume that meanings are in words rather than in people. However, the opposite is actually the case. So meanings for certain words or phrases, for example, actually tend to be in people, right? So you can think about certain words that you might use on a regular basis and how those words have a certain type of a meaning to you. So we could take a very abstract word like the word love, for example, and the word love could mean very, very different things depending on who you ask, right? So, and there are also there's different types of love that people may experience. You might love chocolate, you might love your cat, you definitely should hopefully love your partner and your family, right? So the word love can mean very, very different things depending on who is using the word, depending on the experiences that people have had in the past with love. And so it's important to remember that meanings are assigned by the receiver. And what this means is that I may intend to send a certain message to somebody, and sometimes the message that I intend to send may not be received in the way that I hoped it would be. And this is why it's always important to check to see what people have heard and understood when we are communicating, especially about important topics, right? And later on in this course, we're going to be talking about paraphrasing as a type of listening activity where I can paraphrase the kinds of things that I have heard somebody say so that they can clarify or correct me if I have any mistakes in terms of the way that I'm understanding something. So the third principle is that communication is irreversible and unrepeatable. In addition, the fourth communication principle is that every communication interaction has two levels. The first of these levels is the content dimension. The content dimension of a communication deals with the actual literal message that is being said. For example, if I were to be in a classroom with all of you right now, and I wanted to play a video clip, let's say, I might ask one of the students who is sitting near the light switch to please go turn the light on after the video clip has finished playing, okay? So the literal message of me asking a student to please go turn the light on is simply, please go turn the light on. That is the actual literal message. On the other hand, there is also a relational dimension that is present in that communication. The relational dimension of the message, please go turn the light on, actually says something about the relationship dynamics between myself and the student. So, for instance, if I feel that I am in a position to ask a student to go and do something like turn the light on, that tends to demonstrate that there is perhaps a difference in power between a professor and a student. So the fact that I would feel entitled or enabled to go ask a student to help me by turning the light on or off indicates a lot about the relationship dynamics that are present, right? And what that says is I am in a position to ask you to please go turn the light on or off, all right? Now you could think about it in terms of when you're sitting at home, maybe watching a movie or TV with an older sibling, okay? And maybe your older sibling says to you, hey, can you go grab us a few sodas from the fridge? The literal dimension or the content dimension of that message would be just please go get a few sodas, right? But the relational dimension of that message indicates something about the fact that your older brother feels that he can ask you to go get a soda, right? And again, there's a power play or a power relationship that's being exhibited by that communication, okay? So it's important to be aware of this and to tune into these types of issues as we continue to discuss these topics in the course more. There are also several communication misconceptions. One communication misconception is that meanings are not in words, okay? And as I said a few moments ago, meanings are assigned by the receiver, and oftentimes, or sometimes, let's say sometimes, not often, but sometimes we may find ourselves in situations where we intended to send a certain message and the message that was received was very different. So these are times when we're going to have to work on clarifying what the message that we intended to send was. Sometimes we have to work on explaining or elaborating, but it's very important to keep in mind that just because we say something that is very clear to us, it does not always mean that the person on the receiving end will receive the message in the same way. Another communication misconception is that we have to always reach 100% shared understanding in conversations. Now, I am all for honesty. Honesty genuinely is usually the best policy, and whenever possible, I encourage students and I myself try to be as honest as I can, all right? On the other hand, sometimes there are conversations or moments in our lives where it might be good to spare somebody the absolute truth, or sometimes it might be good to hold back a few thoughts or a few conclusions that you have made about a person or a situation. The reason that I say this is because sometimes more communication about something can actually hurt the situation rather than helping it. So it's really good to think about a few things before you say things or ideas that you're not sure will be received well. Generally speaking, if I'm about to share some information with someone that I think that they may not like, or that it may be abrasive or hurtful, it's good to ask ourselves, why am I sharing this information? Am I sharing this information because I am trying to help the person? Am I sharing this information because I am angry at the person and I would like to get back at them for something that they said to me? Am I sharing this information because I think that the person has to know every single thought that I have about them? Okay? It's always good to run something around in your mind a little bit before you share it, especially if it's a sensitive topic and there's the potential for feelings to be hurt, okay? So think about this. Although honesty is generally the best policy, 100% complete disclosure is not always necessary. And so I encourage you to think about your own life and think about situations where you had learned information from someone, or maybe somebody told you something that perhaps was more hurt than it did help, right? So we want to think about these things as we move forward in our relationships as well. A third communication misconception, which relates to the second one, is that more communication is not always better. So sometimes talking about a topic too much can actually be unproductive. Sometimes if we discuss an issue over and over and over, or you keep talking about it over and over, people can actually start repeating themselves. You might actually get into a negative communication cycle where people start to spiral in a negative way. And so it's very important, if you're starting to see that the conversation you're having is not going anywhere productive, it's good to always take a time out, which is basically taking a period of time where both people agree that they are going to leave the situation and they're going to go and cool off and try to collect their thoughts about what they need to do to manage this conflict more effectively. Another possible option is to enlist the help of a counselor or perhaps a pastor or a preacher if you have a trusted community leader. There's also mediators who can help in relational disputes as well. So if you find that you're in a negative cycle, rather than just communicating about it over and over and over again, I strongly encourage you to truncate the conversation or the relationship and to try to seek help from someone who can help guide the conversation so that the outcome is more productive. We will definitely get into this topic more in detail as the class progresses, but for now, I just wanted to drive home the point that more communication is not always better. A fourth communication misconception is that a person or an event or a situation does not cause an emotional reaction, okay? Meanings that I have for a certain situation or the experiences that I have are my responsibility, right? Now, I am not able to necessarily control all the things that happen in my life, and there are certainly going to be situations in life where things happen beyond your control, and you sometimes are dealing with situations that are a struggle, right? However, at the same time, I can acknowledge that things are happening in life that are maybe difficult for a time being, but at the same time, I need to take responsibility for my reactions and for my responses. What this means is that I am not going to blame my response or my communication on somebody else, right? No matter what they do. So, for example, sometimes I hear students say things like, "Oh, my sister just drives me crazy," right? So, okay, I can relate to sibling issues. I have siblings myself. I do know that sometimes family members tend to say things that tend to make people feel, a little bit upset and bothered. However, no matter what my sister says to me, no matter what anybody says to me, my emotions and how I handle my emotions and what I do in response to what somebody says or does is my responsibility. I cannot blame my behavior on somebody else, no matter what they do, okay? And I know that sometimes this is a difficult idea for some folks because some of us have dealt with situations that are very challenging. However, if you look at this idea from the other side, it's actually a very empowering principle because really, if I think about it, there can be lots of things happening in life, positive, negative, good, bad, right? And based on the behaviors and the patterns and the strategies that I use on a day-to-day basis to deal with life, I can have a very positive, functional response to things that might happen, regardless of if they're positive or negative, based entirely on how I respond to a situation. So many of you have probably heard that saying before, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade, right? Now, I know sometimes when you're going through difficult situations, that doesn't make you feel better. But the principle of that phrase is basically a principle that says that no matter what happens to you in life, if you are able to approach every situation with a positive attitude, looking at what you can learn from the situation, looking at how you'll be able to develop more skill sets to deal with these kinds of situations later, and ultimately remembering to take good care of your mental, emotional, and physical health, especially when you're going through difficult situations, right? If you're able to do those things, then you can still achieve a relative level of stability and happiness even through some of the challenges that life might throw at you, okay? So please do think about this, and please think about situations in your life where you think you might be able to modify some of your responses so that you can find more happiness and peace. It's certainly worth looking at. Looking at the process of communication, we are going to look at two different models here, which is going to bring forth the way in which communication takes place. Now, the first of these models that your book provides is the linear view of communication. The linear view of communication approaches the communication process as a primarily one-way process that takes place between the sender and the receiver. Now, in this image that we see on the PowerPoint, you can see that to the left, you have the sender who is sending a message to the receiver who is on the right. And what you see is that there is a communication channel, which is the mode that the message is being sent through. So the channel of communication would be either in person, it could be on the telephone, it could be through a text message, it might be through an email message, it could also be through media, so for things like television, film, other things like that, okay? And so we also see in terms of this model that there is several indicators here to the top and bottom of what's called noise. And noise is any kind of external noise that is potentially distracting people from being able to hear or process or respond effectively to the message that they're receiving. Okay, so we can look at the linear view, and it certainly does have some strengths, and it also points out some of the important aspects of communication. However, the linear view is actually a much more media-based model because, as you've probably already noticed, it does not have a interactive effect going on between the sender and the receiver, right? You see communication taking place one way from the sender to receiver. So there are some shortcomings or some drawbacks to the linear view of communication. One of these is that it is too simplistic. Another drawback or another aspect of this linear view is that it primarily tends to deal with the communication process that takes place via media channels. So television and radio, I would say the internet right now, web-based communication is also another very relevant interaction that deals with this linear view. In addition, one of the drawbacks is that, as I said on the previous slide, individuals do not alternate messages. So as we can see, this model does provide many different ideas that help to illuminate our understanding of communication. On the other hand, this model tends to deal primarily with communication that is being sent from the sender to the receiver and does not really allow for a reflexive or interactive communication process. So let's look at a different model. The transactional view allows for communication to take place in a much more interactive way. The transactional view suggests that communication is uniquely a human process, and as you can see from the model, there is much more detail about the various aspects that may be playing out in each person's environment when they are communicating. So you can see that to the left, person A is communicating with person B, okay? And so person A sends a message to person B, and this model allows person B to send a message back to person A, okay? So we do see that there is an interactive transactional process playing out between person A and person B. But we also see that this model allows us to look at things like the channel of communication, which we discussed in the previous slide. It also accounts for things like noise, external noise, but it also accounts for environmental issues. So for example, environment of person A, let's say, can deal with things like the physical environment that they're in when they're communicating, but it might also deal with things like culture or cultural issues and how culture informs the expectations that people have about what is considered to be good communication or effective communication. And as some of us already know very well from our life experiences, many times people can have very different expectations about what is considered to be acceptable, effective communication. Much of these expectations that we have or that we develop are based on our socialization and our identity development when we're young. So, for example, my ideas about what is an effective communication is largely based on the modeling that I saw growing up in my home environment. It's also based on the modeling that I saw taking place with professors going to college, right? So we each have our own environment and cultural system that also shapes the way that we approach verbal and nonverbal communication messages, and it also shapes the expectations we have for other people as well. In addition, these types of environment or cultural issues tend to shape how people approach conflict issues, and we will talk about conflict in more detail in the future. But to begin with, these two models of communication provide a really nice foundation for understanding the ways that people tend to interact. So as I said a second ago, the transactional view allows us to understand the sender and the receiver who are both communicating. The transactional communication model also allows us to understand the environment that people are in and how various modes of communication or various channels of communication tend to impact the way that people hear and respond to messages. So for example, there is a big difference between a conversation that is going to take place over the telephone versus a conversation that is going to take place over email, right? Over the telephone, first of all, you're in real-time interactions, so you don't have the process of delaying responses or thinking about how you hope to respond or want to respond, okay? So the real-time aspect is different. The difference between telephone and email is also very apparent in terms of the mode, right, of communication. So on the telephone, you are going to be speaking, whereas via email, you're going to be writing, right? And in terms of communicating messages, there are all sorts of differences that can emerge when we're speaking versus writing. One of the most notable differences in terms of texting or email is the expression of emotion and how people express emotion via email or text message. So it can be kind of challenging because, for example, if I was trying to send you a message via email and I accidentally hit the caps key and I had sent one of the sentences was in complete capital letters, that could have the communicative effect of yelling at somebody, even though there's no actual verbal component of the message, right? It's actually being written. But because I made a mistake and I accidentally typed it in bold or whatever it could be, or, you know, caps, then that could have an impact on the way that people receive it. So this transactional view allows for the communication environment to shape the way in which people respond. But again, we want to remember that culture is also a part of environment. It's not just the actual mode, but also the background that people bring to the communication interactions that they have with others. And it's important to be able to distinguish between the difference with internal versus external noise. So I talked about external noise a second ago, but external noise would be any kind of communication or noise that's in the background that can detract from your ability to hear somebody or to respond or process effectively. So you might be having a telephone conversation with someone, and maybe you have some roommates who are in the background laughing and talking, and that could make it very difficult for you to hear what somebody's saying, let alone respond effectively, right? In addition, internal noise can also be a real challenge for people. And internal noise deals with any kind of internal processing that a person is dealing with, which can challenge their ability to effectively communicate or respond. So for example, people might be listening to this PowerPoint presentation and they may be dealing with psychological noise. Maybe you're distracted because you have some classes that you're struggling with. Or maybe you're distracted because you had a disagreement with your boyfriend or your girlfriend earlier today. Or perhaps you're working on your laundry list of, you know, groceries that you have to go out and get later today. Or maybe you didn't get a chance to eat yet today, and so you're very hungry, and so your internal noise there would be hunger as a type of a distraction. So it's a very important thing to be aware of in terms of communicating, because if we're able to control the environment when we communicate with other people so that it's a more optimum environment, then it's also likely that we will have more positive communication outcomes as well. Effective communicators have several different types of competency characteristics that we want to be familiar with. One of these things is that effective communicators have a wide range of behaviors that they can choose from. So for example, this could include knowing how to respond to situations where you're standing in front of people giving a public speech, for example. This could also deal with knowing how to respond in more private interpersonal situations where you're dealing with a conversation with a friend who might be struggling, right? Certainly, we know that the communication that's required when we're giving a public speech is different than the communication that is required to be an effective friend when someone is going through a life struggle, right? So this is what we mean when we say effective communicators have a wide range of behaviors to choose from. It also deals with the ways in which we personally respond to things that happen in life. So for example, when you find that you have been upset by something, do you have several different ways that you can respond with that emotion of upset? Do you have different modes of coping in place, or do you have just one mode of coping in place for responding, right? So if you are dealing with challenges in life, several situations might exist to help you alleviate some of that, right? You can deal with exercise as a way to increase endorphins, which of course makes you feel better, which of course makes you a better communicator because you have a more positive emotional base to be drawing from when you're responding to people, right? So exercise could be a way to cope with stress. People might also cope with stress through things like meditation, or if you believe in a higher power, you might invoke prayer. You might also deal with stress by communicating with friends or family members who can be supportive, right? So those are ways that people can deal with stress, but in terms of the communication side, effective communicators are able to evoke a variety of different types of communication strategies depending on who they're communicating with, in what kind of context, under what kinds of circumstances, and of course, what the topic is that people are talking about. And all of those things tend to shape what is considered to be an effective response or not. Effective communicators also have the ability to choose appropriately, okay? So what this means is if I am an effective communicator, I am aware of what is considered to be socially and emotionally appropriate responses, and I have the ability to evoke the desired response when I need to for the purposes that I need to do that, okay? We will be talking about this more in the future, but I just wanted to put that out there at this point, okay? In addition, competent communicators also have skill at performing certain behaviors. So I talked about this a few seconds ago, but the communication that is required when you're dealing with a relational challenge, for example, is different than the communication that is required when you are on a job interview or giving a public speech, okay? So effective communicators have a wide range of behaviors. They have the ability to choose appropriately, and they also have the ability to have skills at performing these behaviors. There are several competency stages that people can expect to go through when they are working to develop more effective communication skills. One of these is the beginning awareness. Now, maybe some of you are at this stage right now. Maybe you have realized that there are certain things that you want to work on improving in this class, or maybe there are certain things that you've been trying to work on since before you even enrolled in this class. And so I think it's very good that you're open to looking at areas that can be improved, because it's only through this kind of honest self-awareness that we can actually evoke or create change, right? So beginning awareness is very important, and it's something that I encourage each of you to do at this stage in the class, so that if you do realize that there are certain types of relational skills that you could work on to improve, that you can begin doing that. Because ultimately, if I am able to develop the most types of skills, right, if I have a wide range of skills to choose from, then I will be more competent because I can evoke various types of coping strategies depending on the situation. Now, as with anything new or different, you can expect that you will feel somewhat awkward when you are trying to develop your competency in certain areas that you haven't had before. So just like when you were first riding a bicycle and you had your training wheels taken off, a lot of us were sort of teetering back and forth on the bicycle in a very awkward way, right? So that's the same thing holds for relationships and communication. So for some of us, for example, talking about your feelings might be something that you feel very awkward about. Maybe it wasn't something that you were taught to do growing up. Maybe it was something that you were taught not to do growing up. And so maybe talking about your feelings is something that you really don't do now. However, what we know about relational effectiveness is that people need to be able to disclose or self-disclose to others in their life who they have important relationships with. So learning to talk about your emotions or your feelings is a very important part of effective relationships, and it can also be awkward when you're first starting out. So just so you know, as with anything, over time it will get better and you will improve in your ability to do that, and you just have to give it time and stick with it. Once you go through awkwardness, eventually, after using or cultivating the skills that you're trying to develop, you will develop the skills to deal with situations in a certain way, okay? And so those skills may be dealing with emotions. Perhaps you're trying to work to, to be more positive with other people or positive in the communication that you use. Maybe you feel like you need to work on your public speaking ability, right? These are all different types of communication skills that you can work on. And once you develop those skills, then they become a part of who you are as a person, and you don't have to think about them as much as you did when you were first developing the awareness and the skill, okay? So over time, although you will go through awkwardness when you're trying to develop skills that haven't been cultivated yet, over time you can expect that those skills that you once struggled with will become more integrated into who you are as a person, and that will assist you in using these skills whenever you need to for relationships or communication and things like that. Now, it's important to discuss the idea of cognitive complexity with regards to integration, and cognitive complexity deals with our ability to view an issue or a person or a situation from a variety of viewpoints rather than from a black and white viewpoint. So for example, black and white thinking sounds like this. You're either for me or you're against me, or you're either my friend or you're my enemy, right? So obviously we know that with many issues in life and many people in life, very few situations actually fall completely in one or the other situation, okay? And in fact, a lot of times with situations, the viewpoints that people have about a certain situation really depends on who that person is and what experiences they've had in life, right? So we want to really avoid this idea of black and white thinking. Instead, what we want to do is we want to cultivate cognitive complexity, which is the ability to see issues from a variety of viewpoints and standpoints that are different from our own, okay? Once we are able to do that, we are going to experience more empathy for other people, especially for other people who have experiences or perceptions or who do things that are different than the way that we handle things, okay? So this idea of integration really rests a lot on our ability to develop cognitive complexity, which will also lead to greater empathy, not only for other people, but also empathy for ourselves. And I would really like to stress at this point in the lecture, we're getting ready to wrap up here, that it's very important for any of these skills that we're working to develop that we are kind to ourselves and that we are encouraging and supportive of ourselves as we try to develop these skills, okay? I do not suggest that you become hypercritical of yourself if you do know that there are things you need to work on. I strongly encourage you to learn to become your best friend, okay? Rather than beating yourself up for who you aren't or what you don't do right, why not try to look at the things that you do well? Why not look at the kinds of relationships that you have where you know you are a good friend, sister, brother, parent, sibling, right? I mean, I think it's very important for us to not allow a self-critical internal dialogue to take over. And sometimes when we are looking at some of the challenges we face, it's easy to have that really critical voice come in. So I want you to really think about being encouraging and being supportive of yourself as you develop these skills, and ultimately having empathy for yourself, because the more empathy that we can have for ourselves, the more empathy we can also show to other people. Finally, this idea of self-monitoring is very important, and self-monitoring deals with our ability to monitor the communication that we are using when we're doing it, okay? So when I lecture in front of a class, for example, I am doing a lot of self-monitoring. What that means is I am conscious of the way that I am standing, the way that I'm carrying my body, the types of facial expressions that I'm putting on my face, the way that I'm speaking. I am also conscious of the words that I'm using, because I don't want to use words that are going to alienate people or make people tune out or not want to listen to what I have to say, right? A part of self-monitoring also deals with the way that people are responding to me when I talk. So if I'm in an audience and I have students sitting in the audience and I say something and I see that many of my students start to get a confused look on their face, what that tells me is I need to restate that idea in a different way so that they understand, right? So self-monitoring not only deals with my own communication and monitoring it as I communicate, but it also deals with the way that people are responding to me in real-time interactions, okay? Now, ideally, because we are going to develop skills like cognitive complexity, empathy, more self-monitoring, these things also will lead to greater commitment, right? Because we are going to be more able to read people. We're going to be more aware of the skill sets that we currently have and the skill sets that we need to develop, right? And being aware of these issues and being willing to work on them demonstrates a type of commitment. Now, when we talk about commitment, we can talk about commitment in terms of commitment to ourselves and to our own competency, but we can also talk about commitment in terms of commitment to relationships or commitment to other people, right? So in my marriage, for example, obviously I am in a committed, monogamous, long-term relationship, right? But commitment goes much deeper than just getting married and wearing a ring on your finger and staying loyal to someone physically, right? Commitment deals with emotions. Commitment deals with, mental commitment and fidelity and thinking about someone and being aware of the fact that everything that I do will affect my husband, right? And so if I'm committed to the relationship, I am not just going to just go through the motions, right? I'm going to be committed to the happiness of my husband and the happiness of myself and ultimately the happiness of our relationship, right? And sometimes when we are committed to people or relationships, we have to go through challenging situations in order to preserve the relationship or to make it better, right? So it's good to think about that. And at this stage in this lecture, I think that it's really good to think about the relationships that you have in your life that are rewarding for you. Also, think about the relationships in your life that you are committed to, and what kinds of skill sets do you think you could develop in order to demonstrate even more commitment to your friends, maybe your long-term partner, perhaps your family members. Let's also think about the relationship we have with ourselves, right? The commitment we have to ourselves. Ultimately, having a good relationship with ourselves, taking care of our own mental, emotional, and physical health, being a positive cheerleader for ourselves, right? Being encouraging to ourselves, being loving and kind to ourselves, not beating ourselves up with criticism when we make mistakes. These are all very important parts of becoming a competent communicator. And so some of these things we really don't tend to think about much, but the purpose of a class like this is really to unpack a lot of these ideas so that ultimately we can start to assess our situations, we can start to look at areas that we need to work on, and ultimately we can improve our skills in terms of being a better communicator, in terms of how we deal with other people, but also the relationship we have with ourselves, okay? So thank you very much for your attention in Lecture 1. As always, please feel free to email me with any questions you might have. I look forward to hearing from you, and I look forward to learning more about you all throughout the course of this class. Thank you, and I will talk to you all again in Chapter 2.